Hi, and welcome back to another AnyRPG Development Livestream. In these videos, you can watch the live development of the AnyRPG Engine, a free and open source role-playing game engine designed in Unity and written in C#. If you don't already have a copy of AnyRPG, you can pick one up from anyrpg.org/downloads in both Unity package and source code format. You can also download A Lost Soul, the free playable game that I work on in these episodes, at the same page. In this episode, I'll be continuing the work on the new character stat system. So we're refactoring a bunch of the code in the engine to remove the assumptions that the character only has 4 hard-coded stats, and that those stats are intellect, stamina, agility, and strength. In the last episode, we changed these values so they're no longer needed, and we moved them into a class where we can define the stats, and then I added a bunch of custom ones like wisdom and spirit. So in this episode, we're just going to be continuing the work necessary in order to make that work. And unfortunately, I didn't realize that when you close Unity, when you've got script errors and reopen it, it actually shows you this, and you have to fix everything before you can see it. So we're just going to go through and basically fix some of the missing references and continue on with the work. So in the last episode, basically when we left off, we had set up the code to add the character class stat modifiers and then the system stat modifiers. So you can define stats that are given to your characters at the system level, and you can define them at your character class additionally. And so we built a new handle status update or handle stat update method, and instead of handling stamina update and intellect update, we're now handling stat updates. So we can remove these two things right here because they're no longer needed, and we're not going to be using this primary stat modifiers thing anymore because now we actually have both the stat and the modifiers stored inside of this character stats dictionary. So we'll get rid of those 2 issues right there and save that. And then when we set the primary stat modifiers, if this is an AI character doing it, they're already going to have the character class set. So we should perform a check if the character class is set, and then call add character class modifiers if it is. If it isn't, then we're not going to worry about it. We will be calling this directly for the player character in some other way. So let's go ahead and add that check. So basically this is character stats. So character stats has access to our base character, and we want to know if his character class is set. So if base character dot my character class does not equal null, then we want to also add our character class modifiers, which just is basically setting up the dictionary that allows us to get informed whenever a stat gets updated so we can do something about it, and to track what actual total amount of stats this character has. So we'll actually be sending in this right here. And actually, because this is C#, we should actually just check first if base character does not equal null, because it is entirely possible that something like this could potentially get called like while the character is being destroyed. Okay, that's good. And then, so in handle stat update, if we go to the definition of that, I made some notes in here last time basically. So check if the stat that was just updated contributes to any resource, and if it does, throw out a resource change notification handler, and check if the stat contributes to health, and if it does, throw out a health change notification handler. So basically, we don't want to do this because what we're going to do is health is just going to be a resource like anything else. You can spend health and you don't necessarily need it. And so this means I actually kind of want to use this mechanic in an upcoming fight that I'm going to release in the dungeon. So we've got like this Luna mech, and he can drive around and he can shoot lasers at you. And I want him to be completely immune to all types of damage. And I want basically health just to be another type of a resource that you can reduce on a character. So that means that he'll basically just shoot lasers at you using up energy until he dies because he has no energy. It'll be a fight where you just have to dodge him the whole time. So we can do all sorts of cool mechanics like that if we remove this hard-coded notion of even health being a thing. So let's go to the health change notification handler, and basically let's see what we do here. So we set our current health equal to the clamp of the current health and the max health, and then we call the on health changed method. So let's see how that differs. This is the primary resource amount change notification handler, which is basically this call right here. So pretty much what we should be doing is actually doing this call. So we want to basically make sure that the logic that it was in the health change notification handler is the same as in the resource change notification handler, and then we should be able to sort of make that a more generic interface. So we'll go to the health change notification handler, go to the definition of it here, and just check. So we set the current value equal to a clamped value. So let's go look at that. We see when we set other thing, we do it the exact same way. Perfect. And then we call on primary resource amount changed, max primary resource, current primary resource. And then here we call on health changed. So I think what we need to do is we can make this a little more generic. We can pretty much actually just get rid of this entirely because we'll have everyone subscribe to this. But I think we'll make this method a little more generic. Like we'll just make it like on resource amount changed. And potentially what we should do is we should just send in like a string with the resource name or like the resource as an actual class. So to do that, we still need to do exactly what this code says right here. We need to check if the stat that was just updated contributes to the particular resource that we're concerned about. And then we should basically throw out a resource amount change notification handler for each resource individually. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just gonna, let's see, we don't even need health change notification handler here, so we can actually just get rid of that message. It's not needed anymore. And then here, we should just perform some type of loop, basically. And then for each resource that our stat contributes to, we want to go ahead and perform a resource amount change notification handler for it. Okay, so to do that, we need to basically check the contribution amount that this stat gives to a particular resource. So we have contribution amounts to power and crit rating over here in this file. And this is where in the stat scaling nodes, nope, that's where we store our stat scaling. And we have these stat to resource nodes. So this is where we need to do it basically. So we've got this stat conversion list here. And this is where we have our stat name, and the power resource name is right here. Okay, so what we want to do basically is we want to find the stat to resource nodes which are defined on the character class level. So we want to loop through the character's character class, find all the stat to resource nodes on it, we want to check if in the character stat to resource node conversion table the stat name that was just updated exists. Okay, good. So let's do that. So here, first we need to check and get a reference to the character class. So if our base character does not equal null, and our base character dot my character class does not equal null, then we're going to perform a loop. So for each, what are we looping through here? We're looping through the base character dot my character class dot, and this was stat to resource nodes. And I don't think that I have exposed that. There. So we're looping through the stat to resource nodes, which gives us a bunch of stat to resource nodes. So for each stat to resource node, stat to resource node in the stat to resource nodes. Okay, and then next we needed to loop through the character stat to power resource nodes, and that object is called stat conversion. And stat conversion is not exposed, so we will expose that. So we're going to do for each node in stat conversion. Okay. So for each, and here we're looping through the stat to resource node dot stat conversion, and stat conversion delivers us a character stat to resource node object. So character stat to resource node object, and call that character stat to resource node. And then if character stat to resource node dot stat name is equal to the stat name that we just took in, then we want to send out this amount change notification handler for that resource. Okay, so to do that, we'll put this in here, and now we need to send in the resource basically. So the resource is stored not in the character stat to resource node, so it's not inside the inner loop. It's let's see if I can get back there, inside the stat to resource node under the power resource class. So we can send that in, power resources exposed. So that'll be the stat to resource node dot power resource. So basically, we can change the name of this function. It should actually be resource amount change notification handler, and now we send in the resource because we're not going to deal primary or anything. This is a generic method now. So let's go to the definition of that, and let's just check if this string exists and we're already using it for anything. They all say primary, right? Good. We're not using it for anything. Okay, so we will rename this to resource amount change notification handler. And what is, we've got an unresolvable conflict. Okay, I'm just going to deal with that conflict. So next we want to accept the power resource, because this is now a generic method. So primary resource is a power resource. And we're actually just hard coding this right now. Let's go find, go to the definition of primary resource. So primary resource basically just grabs item 0 on the power resource list, which is essentially assumed to be your primary resource that controls your health at any time. So here, we want this to be a little bit more generic. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to actually have just 2 of these methods for now, because there's potentially a use case for actually having a primary one of these, pretty much. So let's actually just keep the old primary one, and we'll also keep this new one here. And in this case now we're not checking if the primary resource is null, we're checking if the power resource that we accepted is null. And then we set that power resource's value. And here we need to actually know the max value of this particular power resource, because we can't use this primary resource. And we also need to get the value of the current value of this particular resource. So here we can just reference this because we actually have this information available. So instead of my max primary resource, I think it'll be, instead of current value, it'll just be dot max. I don't think we expose that. Okay. So let's go to the definition of current value. And we don't. Okay. So let's see how we're calculating my max primary resource and just calculate all resources the exact same way. So basically, we have my max primary resource. I might have actually made a method for this. I might have actually made a method already called get max resource amount or something. Let's search for this string right here, because this is how we're actually calling these resource maximums, and let's see if there's already another function. So we have set resource amount, add resource amount, get power resource max amount. That is exactly what I want. Get power resource max amount. So that's what we'll be calling. Okay, so here we want get power resource max amount and send in the power resource. And then here we want to do the same thing, get power resource max amount, send in the power resource. Okay, and this is a float, so we're just going to cast this to int. And then on primary resource amount changed, we have current primary resource. So that's this new value right here that's in our dictionary, the current value. Okay. And once again, I think this is an int, so we're just going to cast that to int. All right, so that's a nice generic method now that we can use for these resource amount change notification handlers. Now let's go to on primary resource amount changed. Let's add a new delegate here on resource amount changed. And let's add a power resource as the first parameter. Let's find out who is subscribing to this. All right, so we have attempt regen here. So essentially what happens is because resources can regenerate, whenever a max amount changes, we might have to start regenerating to full, basically. So let's go to the definition of that and just see what happens here. So this is for the character combat. The character combat has another out of combat regen that's separate from the actual stat regen. So I think we can actually just remove this one altogether. Now let me just confirm that because the character stats actually are subscribing to this as well. I think. Okay, let's actually find that regen amount. So what we want to do is we want to go to the power resource and we want to find all references to this regen per tick here, and then we want to find where that's used, and this is used in perform resource regen. And perform resource regen is actually called in the update method. So what this means is that we actually used to subscribe to an event that would check like whenever a resource amount was updated, whether or not regen needed to happen. But because the regen is more generic now and it just is happening automatically all the time and just checking whether we're in combat or out of combat and applying based on that, then essentially we don't need to perform that manual regen anymore. In addition, like character combat has no need to really, it won't let me go back any farther. Character combat has no need to worry about that individually. So let's see if I can find, yeah, there we go, attempt regen. Okay, here we go. So player combat no longer needs to subscribe to this. This is handled automatically now because health is no longer hard-coded in the engine. So basically we can just remove those. Let's go to the attempt regen method. And we can get rid of all those. We don't need to attempt to stop the regen anymore. And we can delete the whole regen routine variable that was previously tracking it. And let's see, we've got some red showing up down here, so we don't need to worry about attempting stop regen on disable. We don't need to worry about attempting stop regen on process level unload. We no longer need to worry about out of combat regen at all in the character combat because that's already taken care of. Okay, that's good. So then we can go back and let's just keep on going back here. All right, now we don't have to clean up those event subscriptions anymore. We don't have to worry about attempting to stop regen at all anymore. Let's see, we've got some more red up here. We don't need to attempt regen on start. This is all handled automatically because it's a power resource now. This is actually really nice. It's really cleaning up the code a lot, basically, to remove this hard-coded notion of health. We don't even need to do this entire block of code there. Okay, good. That pretty much solves the combat issues. So let's see. Who else was subscribing to on-primary resource amount changed? Let's find all references and see. The unit frame controller. The unit frame controller is subscribing. Okay, so this makes sense because when we've got a character selected and we're watching it with a unit frame, our unit frame controller needs to update their bars whenever their amounts change. So let's just go see how we're handling this. So if we go to the definition of on resource amount changed, okay. So what's happening here is previously this call was basically only used for things that weren't health. So this is pretty much hard-coded to use like the second bar on the character's unit frame. So we're using basically the mana slider right now. And I just didn't change the name on that because I didn't want to lose the references. So basically we can just say that this is the resource slider, this is rage, this is the mana, this is the energy, whatever. So what we need to do here, I think, is we need to have this a little more generic. We should accept the power resource, I guess, and then update the bar based on whichever power resource changed. So to do that, let's see what we want to do. The way that I want this to work is that the unit frame is completely generic. It'll just start displaying the power resources in order and stop displaying them when it runs out of space. So basically your first two. So for any character class, that means you want to always put like the health as the first resource. So health will show on the top of the bar, and then your mana, rage, or whatever is going to be your second resource. So let's see, when we receive a resource amount changed, we want to know which order that resource is in for that character, and then update the appropriate slider based on that. So we have a mana slider, and we also have like a health slider. So let's see here. I think if I just copy this to sort of demonstrate, I think we've got a health slider here. Yeah, health slider. Okay, so let's do that. The unit frame controller has a reference to the target, and so it can figure out its character class, so that's fine. We can gain access to that information, and we'll send in the power resource here and then go figure out which bar we're going to update based on what index number that power resource is. So we'll take in power resource, and here this code is going to be different based on it's kind of ugly right now. I'm just going to have basically an if-then statement around this. We'll be calculating the resource percent based on basically current health amount over max health amount. even though it's technically not health, it's just whatever your primary resource is. Okay, so let's go figure out which resource we're dealing with here based on the character class. So we have a target. If target, current target, who are we targeting here? Follow target. Follow game object. I think this is what we're targeting. Let's go to the definition of that. Yeah, we've got a follow game object. I can't remember if we actually set anything else. We have the follow transform. I can't remember if we set a variable for something that has stats or not. Let's just look through the code here. I want to see where we're getting our health values from, because wherever we're getting our health values from, nameplate unit. We're grabbing the nameplate unit off the follow game object as a get component call. This seems kind of inefficient. I think we should maybe cache this. So here, we're basically setting the power resource color. So let's see, we'll need to basically do this code twice right here. We'll want to actually have two power resource colors because we'll want the health color to be changeable as well. So let's go to the definition of power resource color. And we'll have power resource color 1 and power resource color 2. And I'll just make this green and blue by default. So first we want to check if the power resource list is actually bigger than 0 in the first place. So I think what I want to do here is I want to cache the nameplate unit, and I actually want to cache the character unit as well. So let's do that then, because I've got too many get component calls in here, and that's not fantastic for performance. So we've got the follow game object. We will be caching the nameplate unit, and we will be caching the character unit as well if it exists. Okay, so when we set target, we no longer need to declare that. We're just going to try to grab it. And let's see, we call initialize position, I believe, after we set the target. So here we can just simplify that to nameplate unit. And here we can just simplify that to nameplate unit. And here we can simplify that to just nameplate unit. And here we can simplify that to just nameplate unit. All right, much better. And then well, let's see what we want to do. Is we want to set something right here. So basically, if nameplate unit as character unit is character unit. I don't know if I need brackets in here or not, but I'm going to put them in here anyway just to be really explicit. Yeah, if nameplate unit as character unit is character unit, then we want to set character unit equal to nameplate unit as character unit. That'll just make the code a lot prettier here. So now we can basically just check if character unit, actually else what we're going to do is we're just going to set character unit equals null, just to be really specific. So if character unit does not equal null, which is a lot better, and character unit dot my base character does not equal null, and character unit dot my base character dot my character class does not equal null, then we want to switch out that as well. Okay. Next up, we want to do an if statement and basically say we want to grab the count of the power resource list is greater than 0, then we'll set power resource 1. And similarly, if the count is greater than 1, then we'll set power resource color 2. Okay, that looks pretty good. Here, nameplate unit as character unit, we already basically set that as character unit. Okay, so here we already did a get component when we set the target, so we don't actually need to worry about this right here. Here we already set character unit, so basically we can just check if character unit is not null. And we can remove all of those casts right there because we now have a reference to the character unit. Okay. And finally, we can do what we need to here, and we're going to subscribe to on resource amount changed, and now we're going to do our on resource amount change code. Excellent. So now let's go to that code and we can fix this up. So basically we have a reference to the character unit now, which means we can finally get our reference to the character class and then figure out whether the power resource was actually part of that. Okay, good. So basically if character unit does not equal null and character unit dot, I think my character does not equal null, and character unit dot my character class does not equal null, then we can do all this stuff right here. So we'll cut all that and we'll put it inside of this if statement. So the next thing we want to do is we want to figure out our resource position. So we'll make a counter and we'll set it to 0. Then we need to run through all of the resources available to that character. So how do we want to do this here? We'll do for each, and we're going to loop through the character classes power resource list. Yeah, that's what we want to do. Which will give us back power resources. Good. So I wonder if we can get index. Okay, let's see. We're going to loop through the list. Just do this easy way for now. If power resource that we accepted is equal to, and since we're looping through the power resources, we're going to get a power resource here, and we're going to grab this as just underscore power resource. If power resource is equal to underscore power resource, let's see, we'll just do a Boolean. Call it update bar. We're going to set update bar equals true, and then break. And let's see, if the counter is greater than 1, we're also going to break because we've only got 2 bars to update. And then we're going to do counter plus plus. Okay, so now what we can do is we can ask if we're going to update the bar. All right, good. And if our counter was equal to 0, then it's time to update the health bar. If our counter was equal to 1, then it's time to update the mana bar. Even though these are technically health bar is just resource bar 1 and mana bar is just resource bar 2. All right, so then here, we're going to have to update the right text as well. So if we're updating the mana stuff, we'll update the mana text. I think I probably have like some health thing here too as well. We do. We have on health changed. Okay, so basically this is all the health code here. I'm thinking maybe we just directly call on health changed. That might be easiest. Let's just do that for now, basically, because we know that code is already all working. So max resource amount, we'll just pass that on, and then current resource amount, we'll just pass that on. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So here is power resource color 2 and power resource color 2. Okay, good. So basically, if it's the first resource on the character, we're going to call the update health code, which basically updates the health slider. It's all sort of like hard-coded to health, but I'm fine with that because we know it's not really health. All right, and then otherwise it'll update the mana slider. So that's pretty good. We've got some more red up here. Let's see what we have here. So this code will need to change. And this will need to subscribe to something different. So on resource amount changed, whoops. That's better. And then we'll have to deal with inanimate units slightly differently. if this is an inanimate unit, we're just going to call basically on health amount changed, and we're going to have it just a second. Let's go to the definition of that. Oh, that's just on health changed. Okay. We're just going to call on health changed for inanimate units because we just want to update the primary bar because they don't have a secondary bar. And in fact, we don't need to call anything there, I think. Okay, that looks good. So then finally the last thing to do is deal with this initial on resource amount changed. So to set the initial values, like we can call the on health changed, and that'll update the initial bar, but then we need to get the character's secondary resources. So I feel like we actually need to pretty much do the exact same loop we did before, where we just sort of go through and figure out like what resources need to be updated. Yeah, I think that's going to be the way to go. So let's do that. We'll just copy that code here. We'll paste it in right here. We will not do that. We will basically just call on resource amount changed, sending in the underscore power resource, and then we want to send in the actual value of that resource. Okay, so to send in the value of that resource, let's see. We need to grab the power resource dictionary, which accepts the power resource. So that's good. So underscore power resource dot current value. And we need to send in an int, and I believe this is a float, so we'll just cast that to int. No, wait a minute, you know what? I think we're actually supposed to send in the max value. Let's just Control Z and see what that was here. Was that the max value? That was the max value. Okay, good. So we're going to redo that all, and we're going to do max value. Now, we're not exposing max value. So I think we can get the current value. Let's just replace that and deal with that right now. Dot current value. To get the max value, we need to actually call the method that looks that up. So I think we had something called get power resource max amount where we could send in the power resource. Okay, awesome. So now I don't think we need to call on health changed anymore, because on resource amount will already call on health changed if it's basically the first resource. Okay, that should make our unit frame controller 100% capable of dealing with these new character class changes. So let's find all references to on primary resource amount changed. And now nobody is subscribing to it, so that's good. So now it should be safe to get rid of that. Now let's go check all the places where we're calling it. And here we're using a power resource, so we can just call on resource amount changed, putting in the power resource as the first property. Here we have a reference to a TMP power resource, so we can get rid of the call to on primary resource changed and send in TMP power resource. Okay, so that fixes up that call. Let's look at the next one here. We have this other on primary resource changed. We are sending in a TMP power resource here. We can do the exact same thing. We can just pass on the TMP power resource. And in this case, we need to send these values in. So we'll send in the current value and then the max value. Actually, this is kind of interesting. I don't think we need to actually call that because character stats already has, let's check, get max power resource amount. Yeah, this will actually call that for us, basically. So based on the TMP power resource. Okay, this code right here is basically just a shortcut to this call because I got tired of writing it long form. Let's see here. We can update that call. It's no longer on resource or on primary resource. And let's actually just go back and see. Here we send in TMP power resource, but I actually did the same thing. I forgot to send in the right value. So let's send in the right value. We're sending in whatever resources value. And similarly, get max power resource amount, sending in TMP power resource. And I believe it's going to complain that these are floats, so we're going to cast those to ints. All right, and let's just actually even go back maybe one step further and just make sure, yeah, I sent in the wrong update values there, so we're sending in the proper resource, and then the max value is going to be based on get max power resource amount of power resource. And similarly, we will need to cast these to ints. Okay, good. So that takes care of that one, this one, this one, we're going to cast these as ints as well. ON3 twist bone. Okay. All right, great. That's done. Let's find the next call here. Similarly, we have a primary, set primary resource amount. Okay. This is a bit of a different call right here. So we have basically like hard-coded code to set primary resource amount and recover primary resource. I'm going to skip this here for a second because I want to come back to those and see who's calling those, because we'll make them call the set resource amount basically. Okay, here we don't need to call on primary anymore. We can just call on resource amount and send in the power resource. And we're already grabbing the right values for it. I don't think anybody's calling this, so we're going to come back to this basically. I don't know if we have a reset resource amount call, so let's make a note. We need to look for that. Here, we're performing individual resource regens, so we will call on resource amount changed with whatever resources current value we're dealing with, and with the get max power resource amount for whatever the power resource is. And we're going to send in as well the power resource and then cast these two ints. And that takes care of this one. Okay, perfect. Now let's go back and look at those other ones that actually we needed to investigate. So let's find all references to reset primary resource amount. See who calls it. Okay. This code, when we set the level, needs to be updated. Essentially what we want to do is go through all resources and reset the resources individually. So we will need to actually do something about that. Now, what we can do is we can actually rename this to reset resource amounts, which is fine because we're going to go through all of them. Let's go to the definition of reset health. We don't really need to do that anymore. Health is no longer a thing. We're going to rename this one to reset resource amounts because it only gets called from this one spot, so it's now a method to update all resources. Technically though, just the first two. Okay, so where else are we looping through those things? We're on line 827 here. me see if I can find the code that I'm looking for here. Ah, there. Okay, it's in the unit frame controller, that's why. Okay, so now we're doing something similar to this over in character stats down on line 827. There. Reset resource amounts. Okay, so what we want to do is we've got our reference to our base character, and we'll take this code right here, we'll put it inside the loop. We will be making sure this isn't null, I guess. We're already looping through the... No, actually we should probably check that as well. Okay, making sure our dictionary already contains that value. Good. So then we're setting the current value equal to the max value. Based on the underscore power resource. Then we will call on resource amount changed. Okay, that looks good. So let's see, we have some more red up here. I'm not going to deal with movement speed yet. We're going to do secondary stats as a separate thing. So here, I think we also need to, let's see, when we change our equipment, we're basically sending out a notification that like all of our resources potentially have changed. So I feel like we actually need to do that same sort of loop right here. And actually, to be totally honest, since this is character stats has nothing to do with the action, the unit frames, so we actually shouldn't be breaking. We actually don't care about breaking in this case. So no counters, no breaking. And resource amount change notification handler for underscore power resource. Good. That fixes that. And then let's see what else we have to fix here. Okay. In this case, what we're doing is basically when we receive a status effect, we have to send out resource amount change notifications. Because if our status effect reduces our stamina, then that reduces our health potentially. So we had some other code somewhere to basically figure out whether or not a particular stat buff or stat contributes to a power resource. So the value we're actually going to be looking for here is status effect dot, let's see. Stat buff type names. Okay, so what we need to do basically is loop through this. Wow, that was a really neat autocomplete there. Okay, let's just make a comment there so the system doesn't do weird things. Okay, so now we're going to for each string stat name in status effect dot stat buff type names. So now we have a stat name. And I need to go find the code that I wrote earlier, I think at the beginning of this episode, to figure out basically all of our character classes stat conversions. So we did that by exposing this stat conversion variable. Perfect, right here. Handle stat update. Let's just copy that. And go back to the code that we need to modify. Right here. Okay. I'm just going to paste that in right here just so I can look at it here for a second. So essentially, that's interesting. Do we actually need to calculate the stat? Because if so, I can literally just pass the handle stat update method. I want to just go see what the stat change notification handler is doing. Okay, we only calculate the stat basically on level up, right? Yeah, like level up or class change pretty much. Okay, so we want to do basically this code, but without the stat calculations. So I feel like, what we should do is we should check actually first if the status effect dot stat buff type names dot count is greater than 0. Then we want to loop through this stuff right here. And at the very end of it, we'll just perform a stat change notification handler because that's a nice generic method. All right, and then I am going to add a new bool to this handle stat update, basically that just we send in whether or not we actually need to calculate the stat, because I want to be able to just do this notification handler. So what we'll do then is basically we'll ask the handle stat update method sending in the stat name and a value of false. Then I will go find the handle stat update original method, and I will make a bool calculate stat equals true by default. And then if we passed in false, then if calculate stat is true, then calculate the stat, otherwise just send out the notification handlers. Okay, perfect. And then now we can remove all these hard-coded things about intellect and stamina and strength and agility. And now basically we're just left with movement speed, which once again I'll deal with separately. So here we need a list of strings. So for each string stat buff type in status effect dot stat buff type names. And here we're actually just tracking now character stats because we're not using the primary stat modifiers anymore. Okay, looking good. And finally, reset health. what reset method do we have? We have reset resource amounts. We're going to do that. I'm going to change the way that resources work, and I'm actually going to, like, each power resource will be individually configurable whether or not when you get revived that particular resource should be filled or not. And basically that means we can control at an individual level. When someone revives me, should my mana bar become full, should my health bar become full, etc. Okay, that's good. So basically the only issues we have left here are movement speed, and movement speed. Except for this one right here. Let's see. No overload for handle stat update matches delegate action string. Okay, so this is because when you subscribe stuff, yeah, okay. So let's do let's do something here. Basically, the subscription thing doesn't recognize overloads with default values. So what we need to do is make a public virtual void handle stat update without calculate. And no, you know what? That won't work because okay, so we need to handle stat update common. That's what I need. So handle stat update common will accept the string stat name, and it will basically do all this stuff right here. Handle stat update will do handle stat update common, sending in the stat name. Now we can subscribe to handle stat update common instead of handle stat update. Whoops, yeah, there. And now that works. Okay, perfect. So just movement speed left to deal with. Here, we don't want to grab my stat buff types. We want to grab stat buff type names. And here we'll just be doing for each string stat buff type in stat buff type names. And we don't need to do this toString call now because it's already a string. All right, let's save that and see what other kind of issues we have here. Okay, so we've got the movement speed ones. We know about those. We're going to deal with those later. And devote a whole second episode to secondary stats here, I think, potentially. More movement speed stuff. We're going to call reset resource amounts here in the AI controller whenever it enters basically its leash state, like so. When you die, it runs back and it's just going to go to full health right away. And we need to deal with the fact that the power enhancer nodes no longer have these hard-coded stamina to crit ratios. So that's 8 more of these errors, I think. Yeah, and then yeah, okay, cool. So we just gotta deal with that. So we're gonna do movement speed, I think, and power enhancer nodes in another episode. So as always, I hope you enjoyed that. We'll be back for part 3 in hopefully not too long, and we should be able to get this to the point where we can actually fix all these errors and actually load the game and see all these changes now. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, don't forget to thumbs up the video, subscribe to AnyRPG YouTube channel, or just leave a note in the comments, and I will see you next time.